Now this is always a controversial topic, but it is so critically important, and it's even more critically important because the more people talk about this topic, the more people that come out and say, that are credible folks, that say an ATV on your land during hunting season does not bother the deer herd. I'm here to say, with experience going back to big red ATCs back in the 80s, I loved when my neighbors next to Cass City in Michigan on Severance Road came out of their farmhouse, got in their big red ATC, drove down Severance Road on the dirt road, backed into the Cass River, half-mile away from where I was at, and they would send 30 deer through in the morning. I could count on it. I hunted the funnel a half-mile away along the river bottom. They had no clue they were doing it. And that's the problem with ATV use. Hardly anybody that's spooking deer with an ATV has any clue that they're doing it. And I'm going to give you an extreme example, and I hope you're still with me, because I'm sure there's some people upset looking at it like, I know those ATVs don't spook deer. I want to give you an extreme example. We're on a property right here that is 40 acres. We have about 8 acres of cover with some switchgrass lines here and there, and about 3 acres of food plots, 2 3/4, whatever it is. We're in a valley right here. In this valley, and coming into this valley, you're hidden in some spots, but you're also exposed to about 20 acres. You're also exposed to the woods behind me. Those woods hold deer. We're spooking deer right now, just with a pickup truck and me talking. It's 2 weeks before the season, 3 weeks before the season. So we'll let this settle down. The farmer is just out here haying. You can see the hay cut around me. And so coming in here with an ATV, the extreme, if you're out there saying that me driving to a blind and sitting in this redneck blind behind me by the apple tree where we get tons of pictures of deer, that's one of the biggest, it's a hub on this property. We get a lot of photos right here, especially through the early season up to the rut. One of our main cameras where we get the most buck pictures. And if you're telling me that driving an ATV through this valley, it's about 250 yards back that way to the edge of the property, and the tree line is basically the property line behind me, and then all those hills where all those deer bed. If you're telling me that an ATV will not spook deer coming into this point to drop me off to hunt, you are delusional at best, or delusional thoughts. And I mean that in the utmost respect, but if you think that's not gonna happen, how could you think that? We have to sneak into this blind. We have some lines over here, and even then we've gotten caught before coming down into this location to hunt. Because even just walking in, let alone driving in, once they heard the putt-putt-putt of the ATV at the property line, they know something's going on. I hunt the property over here about 1.5 miles away. And for 17 seasons, the people that used to hunt that drove their ATV, their John Deere Gator, and a tractor to get in there. And the deer weren't used to that, and even if they were, that's not a good thing, because does and fawns, small bucks get used to it, but those mature bucks around here don't get used to it on these small properties. And so over in that location, we enjoyed, by hunting 12 years next to that property, we enjoyed the removal of the deer from that 40 acres when they used their machines every single time when they came on our property next door. And so that kind of starts today's discussion. And I'll go through a little bit of factors here. I want to talk about 3 quick examples here. An area like this, you can imagine if there's deer up there that spook when an ATV comes in here, they don't just run 50 yards and turn around. Whitetails don't do that. They spook 1/4 mile in this location. 1/4 mile. Now, if we were in more light ag, heavy cover areas, and it's open cover, and the pockets of cover aren't fragmented, it's just long cover for a long ways, open hardwoods, public land setting, things like that, then you'll find when it's light ag, quite a few hunters, deer might spook 1/2 mile. 3/4 mile. And that's the same whether you spook them getting out of your stand or driving an ATV on the land. And then one of the things I really enjoyed is when I hunted the UP of Michigan, public land, gun season, opening day, you start hearing those ATVs firing up and accessing their stand locations. And then deer were flying in to where I'm at a half hour after daybreak and at daybreak, right in that morning time when those ATVs are most prominent, 1 mile to 1.5 miles back in the swamps. They knew what was going on. They knew the hunting pressure, and they ran a long ways. So you can count on it in mixed ag area where you have pockets of thick cover here and there. Maybe they only move 1/4 mile, 1/2 mile. In that mid-range, they might move half mile, 3/4 mile, but when you get into big public land tracks and lots of hunters and good hunting pressure and people using ATVs, if they have the cover and they have the range and they have the depth of habitat, you can spook them a mile or more. And I've seen that so many times. One of the number one factors that I see on client properties, if they're using ATVs, then we do whatever possible to not let them use ATVs, because I'm already there, but I want my clients to succeed. And so when they have problems, I address them head on in the day that I'm with them or 2 days that I'm with them. And driving ATVs on their land is pretty nice, because I can just keep them from driving ATVs, and right there, that's going to improve their buck age structure, put more deer on their land, and that is a really good thing, because right away we can take their property from a 2 out of 10 and make it a 5 or 6 out of 10 without even touching the habitat, let alone if we relocate stands, relocate access, change the habitat, add more food, put the food in the right locations, and make it a 10 out of 10. We can improve it drastically just by getting the ATVs off the land. Because a lot of times before the ATVs even enter the land, just when they start them up, they're spooking deer off the land. Now there are exceptions. You get into some of the fantasy land states, you get 1,000 acres or more. And I've even heard some of the big name hunters, they'll talk about, oh, I just let the deer get used to the ATV. Well, yeah, that works on 1,000 acres and there's no hunting pressure around. It's a state where there's 65,000 bow hunters instead of like Michigan that used to be over 400,000. Kansas has 25,000 bow hunters. Again, Michigan over 400,000. I'm sure Wisconsin's around 300 right now. I'm sure Illinois is in the high 200s, 250,000, let alone going over into Pennsylvania, New York, Minnesota, Ohio, some of the other high pressure states where there's so much pressure, deer become educated by ATVs in a very bad way. And let's look at it like this. Most properties, small properties, as the property size gets smaller and the more intense the hunting pressure, you can't afford to do things like that. So yeah, if somebody has 1,000 acres, 1,500 acres, they can push deer around, and the size of the parcel encompasses their hunting mistakes. So that allows deer to live in those parcels. If you get into one of the fantasy land counties, Buffalo County, and let's say you have 200 acre, 300 acre, 400 acre, 600 acre parcels all sandwiched together, not 40s and 80s and 20s, then you can get away with an ATV there, especially when you add in the ridge and you can access on this side, hunt on the other side. But even then, you can never say an ATV is a good thing. Deer have to get used to it. That's not good if they have to get used to anything. And if those bucks are on your property to get used to your ATV during the summertime, that all goes back to summer habitat, bad habitat for bucks. Where bucks are typically at during the summer, they're not during the fall. And so on great small properties, and I mean small properties, you can even include 500 to 1,000 acres or less, let alone 200 acres, 100 acres, 40 acres that I hunt around here. My one property is 25 acres. You can't afford to make those mistakes. The size of the property does not encompass poor hunting tactics, and that includes using an ATV. There are exceptions, but they're a fraction of a percent of all hunters, and I would even argue a tiny fraction of a percent of all hunters. There's advice out there sometimes that you can use an ATV, not spook deer, drive right to your stand, they get used to it. No, they don't get used to it. If you want to have the best herd in the area, if you want to have the best hunt in the area, then an ATV could significantly ruin that opportunity on your land, no matter how many habitat improvements you make. Habitat improvements, the more habitat improvements you make, there's often a diminishing return, because the more deer you attract to the land, and if there's poor hunting tactics like using an ATV, then the more deer you educate in the wrong way in a neighborhood. And when you're talking 40 to 200 to 500 acre parcels, you can't afford to make mistakes. Yes, someone could argue out there and say ATVs don't spook deer. They might not on their little small situation, but when you magnify it to the millions of deer hunters out there, 99.99% it matters. And so I've talked about the distances. It might be a quarter mile around here. The thing what I find is when we use those ATVs, we take them out there, unless it's a rut, the deer aren't coming back. And so that's another point too. If you have a great area, a great property with good habitat, well, when you go out and sit in the rut for those 10 days and drive an ATV, there's a chance that a buck from a mile away, a good chance, might come by your stand and you shoot a buck anyways, despite the ATV. But it's never a good idea. And someone could even argue, look at all these bucks I've shot using an ATV to my land, the last 50 bucks, in the last 30 years using this method, what I say is, man, imagine how well you would have done without an ATV. You were only hitting the average. Imagine if you were well above average. Imagine if you didn't need the rut to shoot a big buck because they're moving all around after you spooked them. Very rarely is a good time to use an ATV. And this is one extreme example. We would clear deer out just driving the ATV down the road next to the property, let alone driving out in the open and saying hi to every deer in the woods and dropping someone off on a stand location. Tractors, you can almost say the same thing. If you're riding a tractor into the woods where a tractor is not 362 days out of the year, then a tractor's not a good thing either. A pickup truck that makes no noise. If they're out in these ag fields, if a tractor is out here every day moving around, probably wouldn't have the mature bucks on the land anyways, because it's too much stress. But there's a point at which you could drop someone off on a fence row or a tractor with a truck and get into a stand. But make sure this year, if you cannot use it, I mean, there's certainly exceptions. I mean, people that can't access their land without an ATV, people that are handicapped. I mean, there's always those exceptions. But if you have the legs, as far as the strength in your legs to walk to those stands, and you can skirt the outside core areas of your property without an ATV, you and your herd will be better off. And hey, you're already working on your land a lot anyways, you might as well make the most of it. And that's something that can double your potential right off the bat, right away. And it's something that you can improve on this season. There's still time. We're in August right here. The seasons are just beginning. And make that decision this year. And I think you, your family, your friends, and certainly your deer herd and deer hunt will be better off for it this season.